The morning light came in thin and pale through the kitchen window, the kind of light that doesn't warm anything. I sat at the table with my coffee going cold in front of me, staring at the phone screen for the fourth time in an hour, reading the same words I'd already memorized. Dad, Carolyn and I have talked about this a lot. We need some space from you. Please don't reach out to us for a while. We need to figure out our own life without the interference. My son, my only son, Daniel, 34 years old, sent at 11:47 on a Tuesday night while I was asleep. I set the phone face down on the table. Outside, a cardinal landed on the railing of the back porch, looked around once, and flew away. I watched the empty railing for a long time after that. Interference. He called it interference. I want to tell you something before I go any further. I want to be honest with you, the way I've tried to be honest with myself over these past several months, which has not always been easy or comfortable. I am not a perfect man. I have not been a perfect father. There are things I gave Daniel that I thought were expressions of love, and I understand now they were something else entirely. They were a way of keeping him close, of making myself necessary, of building a relationship on a foundation that was never going to hold. I see that now. I didn't see it then, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where things actually began. My name is Robert. I'm 67 years old. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in a house I've owned for 22 years. A house where Daniel grew up, where he learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where he brought his first girlfriend to dinner and sat at the table so nervous he knocked over his water glass twice. I built a life here. My wife Patricia built it with me for 19 years, until we lost her to a stroke in the spring of 2014. That was the year everything shifted. That was the year I started holding on too tight. I'd spent 30 years in commercial real estate development. Not flashy, not headline making, but steady and smart. By the time I was 50, the company I'd built with 2 partners was managing a portfolio worth more than most people could picture. When Patricia died, I bought out my partners. I needed something to do with my hands, with my mind. Work had always been the place I went when I didn't know where else to go. Daniel had just graduated college when his mother passed. He was directionless in the way young men sometimes are smart enough to coast, charming enough to get away with it, but without any particular hunger to build something of his own. I told myself it was grief. I told myself he just needed time. I told myself a lot of things. What I did, and I say this with the full weight of my own accountability, was I made it easy for him to not have to try. I gave him a position at the company. Nothing he'd earned, just a title and a salary that kept him comfortable. When he met Carolyn 2 years later, I gave them a down payment on a condo in Charlotte as an engagement present. When Carolyn decided she wanted to open a boutique, I funded it. When the boutique struggled, I kept funding it. When Daniel decided he didn't really want to work in real estate anymore, I didn't push back. I restructured his role, kept his salary, and told myself he'd find his footing eventually. Every Christmas, the gifts were lavish. Every birthday remembered with an envelope that made their eyes light up. 2 vacations a year, flights, and hotels handled. A car lease renewed every 36 months, both of them, because I didn't want my son's wife driving something unreliable. I thought I was being a good father. I thought I was giving them the life I'd worked for. What I was actually doing was teaching them, very quietly, very consistently, that I was a resource rather than a person, that my value was measured in what I provided, that love and money were the same thing. My friend Gerald told me once, over dinner about 3 years ago, "Robert, you're not raising a son anymore. You're maintaining a client." I laughed at the time. Gerald didn't. Still, even knowing all of that now, I was not prepared for that Tuesday night text message. I was not prepared for interference. Here is what had happened in the weeks before that message, because context matters. Daniel and Carolyn had been pushing for me to move. Not out of Asheville specifically, just out of my house. The house was too big for one person, they said. The maintenance was too much for me to handle, they said. They'd found a very nice 55-plus community about 40 minutes away. Very modern, very social, a pool and a fitness center and organized activities. They'd taken me to see it twice. The second time, Carolyn brought a brochure and had already highlighted certain floor plans in yellow. I told them I didn't want to move. I told them clearly, and without anger, that I had lived in this house for 22 years, that Patricia was in every room of it, that I was 66 years old and in good health and perfectly capable of deciding where I wanted to live. I told them thank you, genuinely, for thinking about me. But no, Carolyn cried, not sad crying, the other kind. Daniel called me 2 days later and said I was being stubborn and that I wasn't thinking about how hard it was for them to worry about me in that big house. I asked him when he had last visited the big house. He said that wasn't the point. I should also tell you that 3 weeks before that text message arrived, I had missed a wire transfer. Let me explain. For the previous 4 years, on the first of every month, I had transferred $8,000 into a joint account that Daniel and Carolyn used for what they called household expenses. It had started at $4,000. I'd increased it twice without being asked, because I could see their lifestyle expanding, and I didn't want them to struggle. $8,000 a month, every month, like clockwork. In September, I forgot. I was traveling for a property evaluation in Tennessee. The trip ran long. I came home tired, and the first of the month passed without the transfer. Daniel texted me on the 4th, not to ask if I was all right, not to say he'd noticed I'd been traveling. He texted to say the transfer hadn't come through and to please take care of it. I sent the money that same day, and I sat with that exchange for a long time afterward. I sent the money, but something had shifted in me, quietly, the way a foundation shifts before anyone notices the cracks in the walls. Then came the text message. I read it again that morning. Cold coffee, pale light, space, interference, don't reach out. I want to tell you I handled it with immediate grace and clarity. I didn't. I sat in that kitchen for a long time, feeling something I can only describe as a specific, heavy species of grief, not the sharp grief of loss, but the slow grief of recognition, of finally seeing something that had been true for a long time. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't text back. I put my phone in my shirt pocket and I went for a walk. The long loop around the neighborhood I'd been walking for 20 years, past the Henderson's oak tree and down the hill by the old Methodist church, and I walked until I was tired enough to think clearly. By the time I got home, I had made one decision. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. Space. Complete and total space. I called my attorney that afternoon. His name is Frank Holliday, and he has handled my affairs for 18 years. I told him I needed to come in as soon as possible. He asked if everything was all right. I said it would be. I sat across from Frank in his office 2 days later, afternoon sun coming through the blinds in stripes across his desk, and I laid out what I wanted to do. Frank is not a man who shows much reaction, but he looked at me carefully over his glasses for a moment before he picked up his pen. "You understand what you're describing," he said. It wasn't a question. "I do," I said. "Then let's be methodical about it," he said, and opened a legal pad. "What I want you to understand about what came next is that it did not come from rage. I was not sitting across from my attorney in a fury, plotting some elaborate revenge. I was clear-headed and, if I'm honest, very sad. What I was doing was simply finally taking seriously what my son had communicated to me. He wanted me out of his life. I was going to respect that, all the way. The monthly transfer was the obvious first thing. Frank noted it. $8,000 per month ceased immediately. Daniel was still, technically, on the payroll of my company in a consulting capacity, a legacy arrangement that paid him $4,000 a month for work that was, at best, occasional. That arrangement would be terminated with 30 days written notice, which Frank would prepare. Carolyn's boutique had been operating with a line of credit backed by my personal guarantee. That guarantee would not be renewed when it came up in November. Frank made a note. The lease on the condo in Charlotte, they had transitioned from the original condo to a much larger townhouse 3 years ago, a move I had facilitated with a substantial gift toward the down payment. The townhouse was theirs. I had no legal claim to it and wanted none, but there was a storage unit I'd been paying for, a streaming service bundle on my account, a AAA membership, a few other small things that had accumulated over the years, the way these things do when money moves too easily in one direction. Small things. but I noted them, because the message I wanted to send was not a partial one. There was also the matter of my estate planning, which Frank and I had last revisited 4 years ago. My will, at that time, left the substantial majority of my assets to Daniel. We discussed revisions. I want to be careful here, because this is the part that is most complicated and where I most had to sit with my own conscience. I have a grandson. His name is Miles, and he is 6 years old, and he is, without exaggeration, the greatest joy of my life. Miles is not responsible for his parents' decisions. Miles did not send me a text message telling me I was in interference. Miles, last Christmas, had fallen asleep against my shoulder on the couch after dinner, and I had sat very still for 45 minutes so as not to wake him. Whatever I felt about Daniel and Carolyn, Miles was not part of it. Frank and I established a separate education trust for Miles, fully funded, ironclad, accessible to him at 18 for education and at 25 with no conditions. That trust was protected entirely from any future decisions I might make about the broader estate. As for the rest, I did not disinherit Daniel out of spite. I restructured. There would still be something for him, but the unconditional, unearned expectation of simply receiving my life's work because he happened to share my last name, that expectation, I was no longer willing to support. Frank walked me out to the parking lot when we were done, which he'd never done before. He shook my hand and held it a moment. "How are you doing, Robert?" "Actually, I thought about it. I'm doing what needed to be done," I said. He nodded slowly. "You know they're going to call." "I know," I said. "What are you going to do?" I got in my car. "Give them the space they asked for," I said, and drove home. The certified letter went out to Daniel 8 days after our meeting. Frank had prepared a formal notice of termination of the consulting arrangement per the terms of the contract, professional and entirely without personal language. Standard procedure. There was no way Daniel could have known yet about the other changes. The monthly transfer had simply stopped. But one missed month had happened before. He might assume another oversight. I want to be honest about those 8 days between my meeting with Frank and the letter going out. They were not easy. I would be lying if I told you I was steady and certain every moment of every day. There were nights I picked up my phone and looked at Daniel's contact and thought about calling, just talking, just being his father in the way I used to understand how to be his father. There were mornings I wondered if I had failed him so completely from the beginning that none of this was really his fault. There were moments when I questioned every part of it. But I kept returning to one thing. Not the text message, not the word interference, not even the condo brochure with the highlighted floor plans. I kept returning to the 4th of the month, the transfer that was 3 days late. The text message that was not, "Are you okay, Dad, but the transfer hasn't come through." That was not a son checking on his father. That was someone monitoring an account. After the certified letter arrived, 4 days of silence. Then Daniel called. I let it ring. He called again 20 minutes later. I let it ring again. He sent a text. "Dad, I got a letter from your lawyer. What's going on? Call me." I read it. I set the phone down. I was in the garage working on a cabinet I'd been meaning to refinish for months. Patricia had always wanted it painted a particular shade of blue, a blue I'd finally found at the hardware store the previous week. I picked up my sandpaper and kept working. The calls came in waves after that. Daniel. Then a number I didn't recognize, which I later determined was Carolyn calling from her work phone. Then Daniel again. Then a long gap, which I imagined was them conferring, strategizing. Then Daniel again, twice in 20 minutes. I did not answer any of them. On the 3rd day, he left a voicemail. I listened to it once, standing in my kitchen in the early morning. He was angry at first. His voice had that tight, controlled quality that means someone is working hard to sound calm. He said he didn't understand what was going on, that the letter from Frank was completely out of nowhere, that he needed to talk to me. Then the quality of his voice changed, and he said, "And I want to tell you this because it mattered to me. It landed somewhere real inside me." He said he knew they hadn't been great about staying in touch, and he was sorry about that, and that he missed me. I stood at my kitchen counter and listened to my son's voice say he missed me, and I felt something crack open in my chest, The way ice cracks on a river in early spring, a sound like grief and possibility mixed together. I did not call back. Not because I didn't love him. I want you to understand that clearly. I did not call back because love, real love, the kind that actually serves the person you love, was not the same thing as immediately making the discomfort stop. I had spent 12 years making Daniel's discomfort stop. I had written checks to solve problems, transferred money to smooth things over, backed business ventures to give him a sense of progress he hadn't actually built. I had loved him all of that time, and it had not helped him. Not really. I thought about what my father had said to me once, when I was 26, and complaining that a business deal had fallen through because of circumstances beyond my control. My father had listened to me talk for a long time, and then he'd said, very quietly, "Robert, the day you stop needing someone to rescue you is the day you become someone worth knowing." Then he'd gone back to reading his newspaper. I was furious at him for a week. 20 years later, I understood it was the most loving thing he ever said to me. The calls continued for another 10 days. I counted, because at some point counting became the way I managed it, turning something emotional into something I could just observe. 41 calls over 13 days. Between Daniel and Carolyn combined, 14 text messages. 2 more voicemails, which I listened to but did not return. The second voicemail was Carolyn. Her voice was different from Daniel's, less anger, more strategy. She said she thought there had been a misunderstanding. She said they had never meant to push me away, just to establish some healthy boundaries, which she said twice. She said they would love to sit down and talk through everything calmly. She said she and Daniel valued their relationship with me enormously. She did not mention Miles. I noticed that. I called Gerald instead, my old friend who'd told me 3 years ago that I was maintaining a client. We had dinner at the Italian place on Marymount Avenue, and I told him everything, all of it, including the parts that made me look bad. Gerald listened the way he always does, with his fork resting on his plate and his full attention on your face. When I finished, he said, "How does it feel?" I thought about it. "Lonely," I said, "and right, both at the same time." He nodded. "That's usually how it feels when you do the thing that actually needed doing." He picked his fork back up. "The lonely part doesn't mean you made the wrong choice, Robert. It just means it costs something. Things that matter usually do." We split a tiramisu after that and talked about his grandkids and a trip he was planning to Portugal. And for 2 hours, I felt something close to normal. I want to tell you about the Sunday about 3 weeks after the calls started. I was in the backyard, late afternoon, pulling up some garden beds I'd been meaning to winterize. I had my earbuds in, listening to a baseball game on the radio, the way I always have, the way my own father did before me, and I heard a car pull into the driveway. I took one earbud out. Footsteps on the side path. And then Daniel appeared at the gate to the backyard. He looked thinner than I remembered. He had my father's jaw and Patricia's eyes, and standing there at my gate in a gray jacket that was slightly too light for the October weather, he looked very suddenly and very much like a man who was uncertain of his welcome. I set down my trowel. "Dad," he said. "Daniel," I said. He came through the gate without being invited. I didn't stop him. He stood about 10 feet away, hands in his jacket pockets, and looked at the garden beds and the half-winterized yard, and eventually at me. "You haven't been answering," he said. "I know," I said. "I don't understand what's happening." "Yes, you do," I said. Not unkindly, just honestly. He was quiet for a moment. A cardinal, maybe the same one, maybe a different one. They all look the same, and also, each one is particular, landed on the fence post at the far end of the yard and watched us. "I know we haven't been great," Daniel said. His voice was different in person than in the voicemail. Younger, somehow. More like the boy he used to be. I know Carolyn and I have been focused on our own stuff, and I know it's probably felt like we only call when we need something. "Probably," I said. He looked at me then, really looked, and I could see him absorbing the word the way I'd said probably when we both knew certainly. "I wrote you a text message," he said slowly, "telling you to give us space. And you," he stopped. "Gave you space," I said. "You pulled the money. All of it." "Yes." The consulting contract. You haven't done any consulting work in 14 months, Daniel. Frank and I both know that. He didn't argue the point. That was the moment I knew something real was happening inside him. Not the strategy of the voicemail, not the management of the situation, but something actual. I'm scared, he said, and his voice broke on the word. Just slightly, just at the edge of it, but it broke. I crossed the yard, and I put my arms around my son, and I held on for a moment the way fathers do, and I felt him breathe, once. The way you breathe when you've been holding something for a long time. Then I stepped back. Sit down, I said, nodding at the old bench by the garden. I want to talk to you, not about the money, about us. We sat there until the light went, the baseball game forgotten, the garden beds half done. I told him things I'd been turning over for months. I told him I was aware of the ways I had made it too easy, and how I understood now that making things too easy for someone you love is its own kind of failure. I told him about the 4th of the month. I told him that the text message, the space and interference text, hadn't made me angry. It had made me sad. And then, after the sad, it had made me clear. Daniel listened. And here's the thing I want to tell you about my son. The thing that kept me from giving up on him entirely through all of this, when he is not managing a situation, when he is not performing the role of the man who has it together, he is capable of actually hearing you. I watched it happen on that bench. I watched him stop defending and start listening. He told me things too, about the pressure he felt, always, to seem fine because I had given him every reason to be fine and he had squandered it, or felt like he had. About how Carolyn had convinced him, gradually, that his relationship with me was enmeshed, a word she'd gotten from a podcast, he said, with a slightly rueful look. About how it had been easier to push me away than to sit with the guilt of never quite becoming the person he thought he should be by now. That one landed hard. I sat with it. I thought about my father again. The day you stopped needing someone to rescue you. I've been the thing standing between you and that, I said. He didn't deny it. So what do we do? He said. It was a real question, not rhetorical, not strategic. A real question, from my son to his father. You figure out how to stand on your own, I said, not because I'm abandoning you, because I'm not going to let you spend your whole life standing in my shadow and calling it comfort. I looked at him, and I figure out how to be your father without buying the relationship, because that's what I've been doing, and I'm done with it. The money, he started. The money is a separate conversation, I said, and it doesn't start with what you're going to get. It starts with who you're deciding to be. He was quiet for a long time. The cardinal had long since gone. The yard was getting cold. Miles has been asking about you, he said finally, and something in his voice was soft and unguarded, the way it only gets when he talks about his son. I looked up at the sky, that deep blue of early evening that Patricia always said was her favorite, that particular shade right before the first star. I know, I said. I've been thinking about him every day. He wants to know why you haven't called. I cleared my throat, took a breath. What did you tell him? I told him Grandpa was giving us some space. He paused. I heard how that sounded when I said it. I nodded. I stood up and brushed the garden dirt from my hands and looked at my son on that bench, 34 years old, in a jacket too thin for October, finding his way back from a place he hadn't fully meant to go. You want to come inside? I said. I'll make coffee. He stood up. Yeah, he said. I'd like that. I want to be careful not to let this story end with a tidy bow, because it didn't and doesn't. What happened in my backyard was a beginning, not a resolution. Daniel and I had hard conversations after that, many of them. Carolyn and I had our own conversation, just the two of us, in February, over coffee at a neutral place, and it was not easy, but it was honest, which is something I hadn't quite had with her before. There were moments of backsliding, moments of old patterns trying to reassert themselves. There were times I had to remind myself that writing a check was not the same as giving my son something he actually needed. The monthly transfers did not resume. The consulting contract was not renewed. What did happen was that Daniel, for the first time in years, started figuring out his own way forward, slowly, imperfectly. the way people do when there isn't someone waiting to catch every single fall. I refinished the cabinet, the blue Patricia had wanted, a particular muted blue like the sea on an overcast day. I put it in the hallway, where she always said it belonged. I stood back and looked at it for a long time. Gerald came over for dinner the following week and looked at the cabinet and said, "Patricia would have loved that." "I know," I said. "How are things with Daniel?" I thought about it the way I've been trying to think about things lately, honestly, without the version I'd prefer to be true. "We're building something," I said. "Smaller than before, but it's actually ours this time." Gerald raised his glass. I raised mine. "To building things that last," he said. Outside, somewhere in the yard that was nearly ready for winter, a cardinal sang once and was still. I thought of Miles, asleep against my shoulder at Christmas. I thought of the phone I had let ring 41 times, and what it had cost me to let it ring, and what it would have cost me more to answer it. I thought of Patricia telling me once, in the kitchen of this house, a long time ago, that loving someone well was the hardest skill a person could learn, that most people spent their whole lives practicing and still didn't quite get it right. She was right, of course. She usually was. But I think I'm getting closer. I think, finally, I'm getting closer.